close the yard completely, then these 40 men will go too. Now, over the 3 years that the project was on the go, obviously the people who lived in Loch Carron made their contacts with the local community. The wives, particularly of the managerial personnel, got involved in the local community. Their children went to the local school, and they obviously made quite an effect. Various new organizations were set up. The preschool playgroup was strengthened in numbers and in enthusiasm, and some of the local voluntary organizations similarly benefited. And of course, when the project wound down, these people went. And apart from the empty houses, which are a sort of memorial, if you like, to the boom years, the absence of some of these personalities has made a difference to the local community. The other signs will perhaps emerge more slowly when the local hotels find that they haven't got the same throughput of people staying in them. The local shops haven't got the same volume of business. These obviously will make their effects known, but that'll emerge more slowly as people realize at the end of their financial year perhaps just what hasn't happened in the previous 12 months. But it may change. They may get another order, who knows.
So it's that kind of thing. They sit waiting.
Obviously there are a lot of people who have a vested interest in another order for the site. A lot of people built up local contracts with the site, local supplies, local services, local filling station, all enjoyed a far better time when the project was going than now. And such people have a vested interest in something coming, obviously. Whether it's a good thing for the community as a whole is a different matter, and something the community itself must answer.
You talked about how some of the people realized that it was a short term and it was a fast get in, get what you can, and then reinvest it. Mm-hmm. Have some of the people actually been able to carry on now with a new, say, a fishing activity or something like that as a result of what they did there?
Well, I certainly understand this to be the case, and of course it's been a feature of crofting life in the West Coast for a long time that a lot of the men have relied on seasonal work. Traditionally it's been working on the roads to supplement their croft income. Others have gone further afield for a few months at a time to work on construction work. This has been a traditional pattern. The only difference with the development at Kishorn was that for a change this work was on their doorsteps, and probably their incomes were far greater than they'd ever have got from working on the roads in the winter months.
What about from Skye, where was there a fairly large workforce drawn from there, and what's happened since in terms of, have they had to leave and go elsewhere?
I'm not just sure how many men were commuting to the site from the Isle of Skye, but of course as soon as Howard Doris set to work there was a tremendous demand from men in the island, where there's always been traditionally high unemployment rates, to get work at the site. And Howard Doris did lay on a ferry service which ran from Skye to the site fairly early on in the development. And obviously this meant very large incomes for an area that traditionally is a very poor area. For all the romantic connections of the Isle of Skye, it is basically a very poor area. The crofting is poor, and the number of employment opportunities are very limited, so obviously the site represented a golden opportunity for the people in Skye. Now when this project comes to an end, it creates serious problems in the Isle of Skye. If you like, expectations have been raised. They look for other projects. And yet the long-term prospects for the Isle of Skye are not promising. The basic diet of crofting and tourism is reasonable, but it's not a base to create a really stable community on. And the unemployment rate amongst men in the Isle of Skye is currently running at about 28%, which is very, very high by Scottish Highland standards, and it represents a real problem. There are raised expectations, people are looking for jobs. How they'll be met, I don't know. And it obviously fuels some of the enthusiasm for new development and large-scale construction work in the island.
Yeah, I wonder if we could maybe start off again with just sort of things that you've observed.
I think there are two features of oil development in a rural area such as the Highlands of Scotland. One is the sheer scale of the enterprise, and the second is the speed with which it operates. Just to give you an example, the yard at Kishorn grew to employing 3,000 people. The yard at Nig in Easter Ross grew to employing 3,500 people. Now this is in a region where the previous largest single industrial unit employed about 700 people. And certainly in terms of Kishorn, this was in an area whose population was about 4,000 people. So the sheer scale of the operation and the size of the accommodation which has to be provided for what is basically an in-migrant labour force is something which defies comparison. And obviously it raises a lot of fears amongst local people who, unless they've travelled widely and had experience of large industry, find it very difficult to comprehend just what this means in their district. And scale, the speed rather of the development. The oil industry, of course, always works against a deadline. They want everything done yesterday, and this is something which people are not very often used to in rural districts. Just to give you an idea, the oil fabrication yard, the platform fabrication yard at Nig, it was first given publicity in the October of 1971, I think. Planning permission was granted through the autumn. They moved on to site in the March of 1972. By the June, they were employing 600 men on site, and by the following autumn, 1,000 plus men, and the site just grew and grew. Now, that sort of time scale gives you no time to provide all the other essential things that are needed as a backup. New schools, new houses. A new house in the Highlands takes at least a year to build from the design stage through to completion. A new school takes nearer 2 years. And inevitably, where you've got a large development like this, there isn't time against the oil time scale to build the houses. And this creates a lot of problems, and it means there have to be a lot of temporary solutions. Caravans, labour camps, liners to house men on, schools with temporary huts, prefabricated extensions. And these are not happy solutions. In an area like the Highlands, which has always prided itself on the way it treats its incomers, the way it develops its facilities and services, these are not happy solutions by any means. And inevitably they mean a lot of unhappiness. The climate of the West Coast, for instance, is not a marvellous place to be living in a caravan in, particularly if you're cooped up with a wife, with young children, with your husband away 12 hours on a shift, with a lack of footpaths, roads, and so on. It's not a happy situation at all, and inevitably there are a lot of problems which are generated at the family level, at the personal level, because of inadequate facilities. So the speed with which the industry moves does mean that you've either got to accept a temporary solution to a lot of infrastructure problems, or else you've got to tell the oil industry to wait while you plan ahead. And it's not every oil industry that's prepared to wait.
What about the local authorities? What kind of control can they impose or can they exert over the incoming industry of this scale?
Well, under Scottish legislation, the planning authorities can establish a whole variety of conditions which they can attach to a planning permission when they grant it to a new development. Now, some of these are enforceable and some of them aren't. I'm certainly not an expert on the way that the law works, but some conditions are enforceable by law. They relate to the landscaping of a site, to the emission of noise, the emission of light on site, and these of course are things which are important where a site's adjacent to residential areas, for instance. But there are other areas which are more difficult. The problems with which you enforce the lack of work on Sundays, for instance, where you're up against this definition that the company will set of what is essential and what isn't. It's a very difficult thing for a planning authority to enforce. And then there are other areas. To what extent you can force a company to make adequate social provision for people living in their labour camps, for instance. This is a difficult area, and inevitably a company will argue their men don't want to spend their whole leisure time living on the job in their own labour camp. And you certainly can't restrict the movement of men and vehicles on and off the site to use local facilities. And inevitably this is going to mean that there are social impacts which you cannot legislate, which are going to spill over a fair area around the development site. So it's very difficult. There are areas where you can enforce pressure and areas where you can't. But of course, with the oil business, there's always this sort of economic pressure, often termed in terms of the national interest. And there are very few planning authorities who are going to really stick their neck out against the argument of the national interest and thereby slow down the completion of a project. See, so much, particularly where you're dealing with the North Sea, it works on weather windows and so on, and so everything's got to be done against a particular dateline, and it's very difficult for a planning authority to put that in jeopardy by sticking to the letter of the law on whatever conditions it lays down in the first place.
What